We would like to thank you for joining us today. This is our panel, Writing a New Chapter, Sharing, Promoting, and Solidifying Historically Excluded Stories. So the way this is going to work today, the format, is going to be as follows. Each presenter will have approximately 5 minutes to share an overview of their research.
Hold on a second. It hasn't actually started on feed loop. I'll let you know when it starts.
Sorry. I was ready. Okay, hello everyone. We would like to thank you for joining us today. Our panel is Writing a New Chapter, Sharing, Promoting, and Solidifying Historically Excluded Stories. So the format of today's session, how this is going to work, is that each presenter will have approximately 5 minutes to share an overview of their research. And then this will be followed by questions posed between panel members. And then finally, we will open the floor up to audience questions. So please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A, and we are going to do our best to monitor that for your questions, okay?
Okay, so our first panelist today is Richard Cheu. He is a public historian who has conducted independent research since the 1970s on the Chinese American experience during the Chinese exclusion era. Exclusion lasted for 86 years from 1882 to 1968. The 65 oral histories he conducted and digitized and archived at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is currently a PhD student in world history at St. John's University writing his dissertation. He has initiated a national research project, the Paper Sun Census, to retrieve demographic data about Chinese immigrants during the exclusion era. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Hayley and Sarah. I want to mention that I originally intended to discuss the oral histories I conducted about the Chinese American experience during America's Chinese exclusion era. However, I recently initiated a research project to retrieve previously hidden data of the exclusion era, and that is the subject of my presentation. I have initiated the Paper Sun's Census Project, a national study to uncover 86 years of hidden Chinese American history. Prior to the 1840s, there are few Chinese in the United States. Significant numbers of Chinese migrants arrived in 2 waves of sojourners during the 19th century. The first were gold prospectors responding to the discovery of gold in California in 1848. The second wave of sojourners were contract workers who constructed the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s. Chinese arriving in California were met with xenophobic racism and claims that they're stealing our gold and our jobs. The anti-Chinese movement in California became a national effort by the 1880s. So that passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act sought to prevent Chinese workers and all Chinese women from entering the United States. The exclusion era lasted 86 years, from 1882 to 1968. And during exclusion, approximately 300,000 Chinese, nearly all men, entered the United States. It is estimated that 95% or even more falsely claimed to be the son of a US citizen. These illegal immigrants are known as paper sons because the surname on their immigration paper application was false. The sponsor was not the father of the applicant. To avoid detection by the United States Immigration Service as illegal immigrants and resulting in deportation to China, the paper sons, their family members, and the Chinese communities distanced themselves from all contact with all outsiders. Chinese America became a closed society. The sojourning Chinese gold prospectors and railroad workers were illiterate young men, and they did not leave any record of their American experiences. The paper sons, their families, and the Chinese communities did not document their experiences during the exclusion. And as a result, Chinese American history during the exclusion era is absent from America's historic memory. The Paper Sun Census project I've initiated seeks to collect demographic data about paper sons by collecting information from their living descendants. They will be asked to complete a census form that I'm creating, providing as much documented information as possible about their ancestor. The name of the ancestor will be replaced by a random number before the form is processed. This will provide anonymity to the ancestral paper's son. The data will be processed using a multivariate analysis, and a final report will be prepared. Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation in San Francisco will conduct a national media event this May during Asian Heritage Month to encourage Chinese American historical venues and association to participate in the study and solicit completed census forms. The Ethnic Studies Library of the University of California at Berkeley will be the repository for the final report and supporting documents. And the final report will be published on or before May 2023. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Our next panelist is Sarah McCoy. She is the Oral History Coordinator for the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies under the University of Georgia Libraries. She received her MA in History in 2019 from the University of Louisville and specialized in public history. She has been with the University of Georgia since 2019 and is responsible for processing, archiving, and making accessible all oral histories for the program.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about one of the main projects that we're working on currently. It's the Athens, Georgia African American Oral History Initiative. And so this initiative supports the sharing of resources and authority to collect, preserve, and provide long-term access to the modern experiences of Black Athenians through oral histories. We do this through working with community partners. So we don't touch any of the oral, well, we don't do any of the oral histories. We don't ask any questions. We connect with community partners and we allow them to identify people in the community and then interview them together. And so what we do with that is we preserve it and make it accessible. And so one thing that we've done is work with local Black spaces to allow the recordings to happen pre-COVID time. And so it was really great to have these spaces that people could go to so that they feel comfortable, because the University of Georgia is a bit difficult to get to, don't have to pay for parking in other places, that kind of thing. And the Black community here also traditionally doesn't have a great relationship with the university, which is something that we can get into later as well, about the shared authority and how that works. But what we do with these oral histories is, one thing is that we just make them accessible. So I'm going to share my screen here. second. There we go, it's popping up now. Okay, so this is our oral history catalog online. It's georgiaoralhistory.libs.uga.edu. And so one thing that I've done is created an Athens Black history subject so that all of our oral histories under this initiative that are recorded, as well as any in the past, are put in here. And so people can easily access them. They are also all indexed. One. So they have subjects, descriptions, and then you can access them with their indexes. So you're able to easily research them, easily go through the oral histories, not have to go through all 45 minutes of the interview if you're just looking at one specific thing. And it's really great for community partners and researchers to be able to share these links as well as listen to them, because we do have a little share segment right here. And we've used that a lot with our social media. So the oral history program itself does not have any social media. What we do have is one for the initiative. And so you can see here, it's Georgia AFAM is our tag on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, if anyone wants to follow us. But here we take excerpts, usually from interviews. If we have pictures, we also include them, and we're able to share them as well as people can link and listen to the interviews themselves. This one was one of our most shared ones, and it's a local Athenian who he was the first Black police officer in the area, and he also had his own restaurant where he was serving white students along with the local Black community, of which Lester Maddox, the governor at the time, called him and threatened to close it down. So really good stories, and the good things and the bad things, we try to share it. We also have a specific one on music. And so, Athens is known for REM and drive-by truckers, but no one really talks about the rap scene or the hip hop scene. So one of the things that we've been doing is also really focusing on the Black music of Athens. We've also partnered with classes, and let me switch. So this is one class made this poster that's going. They made it pre-COVID. We're hoping to put it up in the local library sometime soon. But they wrote this about a community who was bought out by the local government and the university, and so it was used for, I think, university housing. And so all of these people lost their homes, barely compensated for it, and they're actually one of the first things. There was a redress recently, so it's really incredible. So we're able to share that from these oral histories. And that's basically all I have, so glad to share.
Thank you.
Right. So up next, we have Hannah O'Daniel McCallon. She is Assistant Archivist at the Tennessee Tech University Archives and Special Collections in Cookeville, Tennessee. She has an MA in Public History from the University of Louisville and an MLIS from Wayne State University. You're muted, Hannah.
Thank you for telling me that. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Getting set up. Okay, so again, my name is Hannah, and I will be talking about an ongoing project to research and interpret the history of Black students and employees at Tennessee Tech University. So for some background information, the university is located in the Upper Cumberland region of Tennessee. I have a plane flying overhead, so I apologize about that. The map on this slide shows this area. Nearly 350,000 people live in this region. Of these residents, about 1.4% identify as Black, so it's a very small Black community in this rural region. Tennessee Tech began in 1915 as a white-only public college. The university began desegregating in 1964 with the enrollment of Leanna Lusk Officer, the first Black student, and she is pictured on this slide. Historically and currently, Black students are underrepresented at the university. Our fall 2020 enrollment was a little over 10,000 students, but only 4% of those were actually Black students. So in June of this past year, the director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs reached out to us in the archives. They were starting to plan the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Leanna Lusk Officer Black Cultural Center on campus, which formally opened in 1990. They asked for an exhibit on the history of the center and a broader history of Black students and employees at the university. They wanted the history to be contextualized in United States and local history. Most of the recorded research on the Black history of the university was done in 1990 for a fundraising calendar, the cover of which is actually on this slide. The calendar has pictures and short biographies of the first Black students, athletes, faculty, administrators, and some student organizations. This information on FIRST has been copied and reused by the university as its Black history, but no notable changes have actually happened to this history since a few updates on administrators after 1999. So it's very kind of outdated and needs to be expanded greatly. For the anniversary, we decided that the archives would create a series of online exhibits using Omeka, 2 in the fall semester on the Black Cultural Center and 1 in the spring semester on the Black history of the university. It was agreed that archive staff would do the bulk of the research and curating, and that the Office of Multicultural Affairs would review the draft exhibits. The director decided to transfer the records of the Office of Multicultural Affairs to the archives to make it easier for us to research the center. And so on the PowerPoint slide, I have a photograph of a scrapbook as a sample item from their records. And so as I researched in our collections for the exhibit, I scanned items that appeared relevant for understanding Black students or employees and ingested them into our digital collections. Even if I didn't think they were making it into the exhibit, I wanted to have a way to document all these disparate items, that there may be one item in one folder and then a completely different collection, there was only one item. So this was a way to bring all of this together. So far, we have over 2,000 items newly available in our digital collections from this mass digitization work. Digitizing and creating metadata for the materials helped to reveal themes and overlapping events that was really helpful for the exhibit research. The digitization project will also hopefully make future research easier. Most of the university's archival materials on Black students and employees represents their perspective of the white administration and white student journalists, so we wanted to make sure that Black voices were at the center of the exhibits. We created an oral history project to document the experiences of Black alumni and employees from their own perspectives. Undergraduate students in the Multicultural Affairs Leadership Program interviewed alumni over Zoom over the past year. I trained the students and created a handbook to guide them through the process. For anyone who's interested in this type of project, I've uploaded the oral history handbook as a file to this session, so you can look at that if you want. In addition to the oral histories, Multicultural Affairs held 2 Zoom panel discussions of Black alumni, one of student athletes, and one of the actual students who pushed for the creation of the Black Cultural Center in the late 1980s. These discussions were recorded and made available online in our digital collections. So far, we have published 2 exhibits in Omeka on the history of the Black Cultural Center, and we'll publish the 3rd exhibit on the broader Black history of the university in April. The current exhibits cover student activist efforts to found the center, programming and resources provided by the center over time, and how the center has worked to meet the needs of the campus community at particular moments. We also created an in-person display on Black student activism in an exhibit case in our University Center building, basically the Student Union building. We plan to continue the oral history project through the summer with a paid oral history intern. We will continue to create metadata for the items we've digitized, and we intend to revise the exhibits as needed if other relevant sources are identified. And that means long past this year as well. That's the great thing about digital exhibits. So lastly, I've put my PowerPoint up in the files for the session. So if you're interested in our exhibits, you can go to the files and then follow the links to go check out our stuff. So thank you all.
Thank you, Hannah. Our next panelist is Megan Woods. She is a Student Conservation Association AmeriCorps Digital Public History Intern at the National Parks of Boston. As a public history intern, Megan has researched the Great Migration and its connection to African American workers at the Charlestown Navy Yard.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Sarah and Hayley, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Perfect. So just to give you a little bit of background first, the National Parks of Boston is comprised of 3 park units in downtown Boston: Boston National Historical Park, which encompasses the sites of the Freedom Trail, including the Charlestown Navy Yard and Bunker Hill, which are across the river in Charlestown. Then Boston African American National Historic Site on the north slope of Beacon Hill, and then the Boston Harbor Islands National Recreation Area, which encompasses 34 islands and peninsulas in Boston Harbor. I've primarily worked with a Boston National Historical Park team at the Charlestown Navy Yard. Established in 1800, the Charlestown Navy Yard was a site of production for over 174 years. It was at the height of its production during World War II, which required the yard to expand its workforce to include women and more African Americans, both men and women. So during my first year as a public history intern with National Parks of Boston, and I've been with them now for 2 years, I was tasked with finding any links between the Great Migration and the African American workers at the Charlestown Navy Yard. My colleagues at the park had suspected this connection since one of the causes of the Great Migration was the economic pull of war industries in the North during the World Wars. However, they had yet to devote resources to conduct this research. Over the course of a year, I spent many hours sifting through papers and archives, scrolling through newspapers on microfilm, and searching through genealogical records, uncovering bits and pieces of information about the African American workers at the yard, specifically those from the South. And while challenging, by connecting the dots and elevating the stories within this research, we have been able to tell a more complex story of the experiences of workers at the Navy Yard, beyond the notions of teamwork and patriotism that are typically highlighted. To share this research, I developed the program From Migration to Discrimination, African American Workers at the Charlestown Navy Yard, in which I share 3 discrimination cases that were submitted to an office of the federal government against the Charlestown Navy Yard. These cases were submitted by African Americans who all had varying connections to the Great Migration. This program recognizes how these individuals, when faced with injustice, took action into their own hands using the tools and resources available to them. I've given this program and iterations of it several times, both at the National Parks of Boston and other local libraries and organizations. In addition to this program, I created a digital hub on our website called Stories of the Great Migration, so that these stories can be featured prominently in our digital content. This hub provides an introductory article connecting the Great Migration to the Charlestown Navy Yard and includes story maps about 3 Black Southern migrants who worked at the Navy Yard: Theodore Bailey, Helen Lee Franklin, and Tiberius Julius. And I'll put the link to this website in the chat. So the story map project was inspired in part by Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. As she shared the life stories of 3 individuals in her book, I sought to do the same, with the eventual hope of adding more stories to this page. While reading Wilkerson's book, I realized that by just focusing on the lives of these migrants while they worked at the Navy Yard would provide a very limited and narrow perspective, ignoring the many ways in which these individuals served their communities, whether through their churches, social clubs, or activist organizations. Recognizing Wilkerson's words, quote, people would forget about the quiet successes of everyday people of the Great Migration. We hope at the park that this program and these story maps attempt to elevate and remember the successes and struggles of some of the Black Southern migrants who settled in Boston. And so with that, I look forward to answering your questions and continuing this conversation.
Thank you. So while Hayley sets that up, I'll introduce myself. I am Sarah Sims. I am the undergraduate and student success librarian at LSU.
And my name is Hayley Johnson. I'm the government information librarian here at LSU as well.
Hayley and I have been working together for probably 5 to 6 years at this point to uncover the history of a Japanese alien internment camp in central Louisiana during World War II. So when we discuss internment in World War II, most people automatically think of the WRA camps that were formed under the authority of Executive Order 9066. It's a misconception that we've encountered during our research, and that's that all camps in the US that held Japanese and Japanese Americans who had been forcibly removed from their homes were incarceration or concentration camps. Our research focuses on internment camps, which held men and sometimes women and children of Japanese ancestry. Those born in Japan that were living in the United States at the outbreak of World War II were actually classified as enemy aliens, as they were still citizens of Japan and due to anti-Asian legislation, which barred them from becoming US citizens. So in World War II, Camp Livingston was a well-known Army installation located in central Louisiana. It's probably most well known as the site of the 1941 Louisiana Maneuvers, which was a 400,000 man training exercise, which involved 2 imaginary countries fighting each other in the woods, basically. But the story of this camp that often goes untold is the one of over 1,000 Japanese men identified as enemy aliens that were held there between 1942 and 1943.
So our research showcases the long-held beliefs of what is an American and how the effects of othering can have devastating effects on communities, especially immigrant communities. Suspicion, separation, and isolation. These men were separated from their families for years as they were shuttled to various Army camps throughout the country.
So even though these men were held and documented by the US government, uncovering this history has proven to be difficult due to hidden collections scattered across the US from DC to Hawaii. And in some instances, like this photograph that's up on the screen right now, some things are held in international repositories and described in a language other than English. These instances pose numerous hurdles for us that we've hit head on, basically through tenacity, to uncover this history.
So we don't believe that we've done anything out of the ordinary when it comes to disseminating this information. When we initially started this project, we created a robust website with a PowerPoint presentation and a timeline of the research we had uncovered. And this was up for approximately 2 years until our editor asked us to consider taking it down as we were writing a manuscript. So while we did take down the images and the presentation, we do still use this website as an online bibliography resource. So since that time, we've made a point to give lectures and conference presentations on this topic and our research any chance that we get. We've also shared this history and research through magazine articles, interviews, and as well as our forthcoming book. So the one area for us that has been the most interesting in how this entire project has changed our approach to teaching research. The thresholds that we broke through as we researched this project allowed us to see various pain points that students might have. We've used this project and the history as a tool within the classroom to a variety of students. So from first-year undergrads to upperclassmen and even graduate students.
So why do we feel so compelled to share this information? In truth, we are constantly fighting misinformation and what feels like a public will to forget this history. One example that I'm sure we're all familiar with was the proposed use of Fort Sill as a site of detention for migrant children in 2019. Fort Sill's history includes a World War II enemy alien internment camp similar to one that was at Camp Livingston. We cannot forget this history and the repeated trauma that these sites represent. In the midst of the media coverage regarding children detainees at Fort Sill, the Fort Sill National Historic Landmark and Museum had stated that they were not aware of that part of their history. They also said that it's not part of their mission to keep this history. So we ask, if it's not their job to keep this history, then whose is it?
So very troubling today, we are experiencing the same xenophobic and nativist rhetoric that was used to describe the Japanese immigrant community a century ago as outsiders and as different, as a threat. So in the immigration sphere, the last administration's attack on those of the Muslim faith ignited a campaign of othering that was felt across the nation. Rhetoric during this pandemic to describe COVID-19 has led to a tragic increase in attacks against those of Asian descent, culminating most recently and most horrifically in Tuesday's hate crime.
So our motivation in doing and sharing this research is best summed up with the phrase, never again is now. Never again is a phrase used among Japanese Americans so that their history, the indignities they and their families once endured, is never repeated. That phrase has recently changed to never again is now to show support of other minority groups being targeted today. And our aim is to share this counter narrative to give voice to those who've been excluded from the dominant historical narrative. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so what we're going to do, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for your wonderful presentations. We are going to begin asking questions amongst each other. For our panelists, if you just want to answer as you will. But the first question we'll start with, whose responsibility is it to uncover and share these histories and perspectives whose responsibility is it to uncover and share these types of histories? And what are your perspectives on doing that work?
Okay, I'll go ahead and go first. So, as public historians, we have a responsibility to share this information. My thing working with the Black community here, though, is that if they don't want us to share it, then we don't share it. We had a partnership, we were going to have a partnership with a local dance company that a community partner was talking with and talking about getting their histories, and then they recently told them that they didn't want UGA to archive their stuff, and we completely respect that. We totally understand it. And so what I see our responsibility is to just open as much as we can for people, to open the doors and make it available, but then but respect their wishes, of course. I think we just have to have the infrastructure and we have to have the readiness to go out and work with these communities. But like I said, we can't push, we can't parachute. We have to respond accordingly.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. I think that one of the issues with Chinese American history is that most of it involves illegal immigration. And so therefore there's a shame issue. There's a fear that there are still paper sons who are alive and they could be deported if someone pointed immigration at them, especially during the Trump era. So you have this shame and this desire to hide it. Even now, that's why in the study I'm doing, I'm removing the actual name of the person once we've got the data and replace it with a random number, because there's a great deal of shame involved, and decide to, like the Japanese Americans who don't want to talk about the internment era, the Chinese don't want to talk about 86 years of exclusion, so we've lost all that history. So that is something that
I think is occurring in the Asian history, the Chinese American and the Japanese histories that they preferred not to have be known. I'll stop talking. I'll put on my headphones.
Okay, I think I'll add to this as well. Since I'm actually affiliated with an institution who is trying to document the experiences of a group at my institution, and I am in the archives, and this is something that we're trying to do, I think it's incredibly important that the institution goes beyond what they have in the past to try and represent these underrepresented groups. But to do that, kind of like what Sarah said about not jumping in, not helicoptering in and acting like, oh, we're saving you by uncovering these histories you didn't know about, you have to go about it in a very respectful way and actually gain the trust of people. I ran out of time to bring this up in my presentation, but our archives at the university wasn't founded until the 1980s when a congressperson for the area donated his papers to us. And this was someone who was in office in the US Congress from the 1940s to the 1970s and who very actively campaigned against basically every civil rights act that ever was proposed in that period of time. So just the fact that our archives was founded for the papers of this particular politician makes this a very complicated institution for people of color to work with, and I totally respect that. And I think it's benefited us that as the time has gone on, a lot of people don't actually know anything about this particular person, Joel Evans, because he didn't really have a major national persona or not that well known nationally, unlike people like George Wallace from the same time period. So time and distance has helped, but also partnering with organizations has been incredibly important for us. The fact that the Multicultural Center was the one to reach out to us to ask about this helped us so much. If you're not familiar with the history of Black cultural centers or multicultural centers in general, they're founded to be a safe space for students on campuses, students of color, but they're also founded to help promote the history of those groups, since at the time, especially in the 1960s when they were first founded, their histories weren't represented in what was taught at universities. So we're not only partnered with a group that is directly connected to current Black students and Black alumni, but who sees in part of their mission uncovering and talking about this history is very important for what they do. So we were incredibly lucky. And admittedly too, I had only been at my university for 4 months when I was asked to basically take on a project of writing a Black history of my university. So that was incredibly intimidating too. And so trying to step back, make sure to build trust with people, let them know that your history matters to us, and to try and bring in as many opportunities for people to review your work as possible. I don't like the fact that well, I guess this is something we're going to talk about later, but it's a little weird that I'm a white lady who's writing the Black history of our university. So trying to get as much feedback as possible from people was really important to me.
I'll just add, kind of going off of what Hannah was just discussing, is that my institution previously had little to no information on African-American workers at the Navy Yard. In the historical reports, there may be a couple lines mentioned here or there, or African-Americans were just grouped in a whole group of minorities. And so doing this research was important it's important when there's only one side of the story being told at a site that you add more sides to it. And by doing this research, we are able to do that. But I was also very careful, especially in my program, to not say that all African-American workers experience discrimination, because we don't want to have that monolith as well. We have a couple oral histories of Black workers who said that they didn't notice it or didn't experience it. So just being very respectful and conscious about the complexity of these stories.
Yeah, thanks, Shaw. That's very thoughtful. For Hayley and I, the way that our research began was an absolute void in the history here in Louisiana. And it wouldn't have been possible if it had not been a personal connection that we had made of a local Japanese family in Alexandria that actually told us the whole story. So with their blessing and the information that they shared with us, we were able to make connections that we would have never been able to make if it hadn't been for them. So just to try to fill this void that was here, you know, in the state, because there's tons of books and literature in Louisiana about Camp Livingston, but this incredibly dark part of that story has been left out, and it's historic. It's not historically accurate. So, you know, that's where we're coming from. Okay, I'm going to ask the next question. So, how do you reconcile not being ethnically part of a community, but trying to lift those voices to the forefront and vice versa?
Yeah, I think that's a think about, like, you know, there's so many other people that could be doing this so much better, honestly. But one of the things that we kind of think about is that we do have the infrastructure, and we have, because, you know, preserving oral histories takes a lot. And so we have the infrastructure to do it. We have the recording equipment, we have all of that stuff. And so if a community wants their stuff preserved, it is a good well, it's an option. You know, it will be preserved. But yeah, I understand people's hesitancies with preserving at our university. The oral history program is under Richard B. Russell Library. Russell was a hardcore segregationist in Georgia, and it was like, it's just terrible. And so I think that is something that is just so hard. But one thing is to know that it's hard, and to, like, know that I don't have the authority over this history. I'm just preserving it. And I think that's one of the big things. Even with, we have another one, Latinx in Georgia, oral history. As a Latina, I have a little more authority, but I'm not from Georgia, so I don't share the same struggles. It's all different. So, you know, with all of that, just understanding the complexities of it is big. And also, and this actually answers John's question as well, you know, if there's somebody who's wanting to do oral histories and they don't feel comfortable having it stored at the university, or even if it's, like, not university related, we might say, like, hey, let's see if any of the libraries can do it, local libraries, if they have a relationship with the community there. Maybe the local churches, if they have a good relationship and they can help preserve it, then we encourage them to reach out there if they feel more comfortable with that, because it is great to have this stuff preserved if they want it preserved. But, you know, we want it to go to the right place as well.
I tried in my project that whenever possible to use scholars, authors, sources written by African Americans to make sure that their voices shine through. A lot of my primary source research was actually through Black newspapers, 2 local Black newspapers in Boston. And I found those really useful. And as I mentioned, I try and let the sources speak for themselves, as opposed to me inserting myself into these stories. And I think also it was very hard for me, but I was trying to locate any descendants of some of the people that I was researching. And luckily I was able to track down one woman she is the niece of one of the women I was researching. And she ended up, she actually wrote a book. She's a former ambassador. And she wrote a book about, you know, that included her family history and then her own biography. And I was also was able to use her voice in my project. So then she was, you know, using quotes from her autobiography, and I contacted her as well, and was able to share some of the resources that I found in order to, to let her know what I was doing. And she told me that she was very young when her aunt died, and so she didn't really know much about her aunt. And so by having that information, it just kind of helps strengthen the memory of her aunt. So yeah, just to reinforce the primary sources, I also looked at when I went to the archives, I tried to look for in collections of Black activists in the area to also get their perception of African-American workers at the Navy Yard, and wasn't always fruitful, but at least little bits that I was able to find, it did help strengthen the stories that I was telling.
In oral histories, I do teach oral histories and I conduct oral histories. I do workshops, and it's important to begin to teach the interviewer to differentiate between demographic and psychographic data, and to start with your demographic data to give the interviewee a comfort that you're not trying to dig into something, some secrets, but simply start identifying the demographic, and that helps the interviewer begin to define where to follow the threads of the discussion. So that's very important, because as we all know, oral histories are very unreliable if you don't go back. And in my oral history interviews, I always double back, asking the same questions from a different perspective, and then you're going to find out that they're really giving you straight answers. Also, knowing the history really helps too.
Hannah, if you didn't have anything, I guess Hayley and I can talk to this as well. To this particular question, I'm not fully certain that either of us have fully reconciled not being part of the Japanese community. So the steps that we've taken to make sure that we are coming at this history with the utmost respect and just, not just gentleness, I guess, is by, it actually started first with making connections with the community in Hawaii that was particularly affected by this, as well as getting guidance from scholars in this particular field, and constantly asking them questions and emails, and just making sure that we have an understanding to be able to tell this story well, correctly, and honestly.
If I can share with you, I was born in San Francisco during the Excluded era, and because my father was one of the physicians there in the hospital, he couldn't practice in the White House, was a Stanford medical graduate. The being part of the community and being able to speak Chinglish, which is part English, part Cantonese, local, I was able to identify, and they say, "Oh, how's your dad? We haven't seen you for a while," and that gave me an entree. Therefore, I never had them sign a piece of paper. There is no signature, because that would indicate I didn't trust them. And so Stanford Hoover accepted my interviews, and I explained to him I don't have authorization because it was countercultural. He would immediately stop talking to me. And under those conditions, which we're doing back in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, they understood that being part of the culture was important to get them to speak to me honestly. And it was referral by referral. They would say, "Oh yeah, I know your dad, I know your mom," and so on. And that allowed me to get them to, and because at dinner time, we always talked about what was going on, I knew the history, and I could check to see whether they were giving me correct answers or not. That's the advantage of being inside, but there are very few Chinese American historians who understood that. And they are usually born outside, they don't speak the language, and they don't have a connection. And even though they look Asian, they look Chinese American, they're not accepted as an insider, and people will not give straight answers. So I can really understand the difficulties if you're not part of the culture. If you don't look like one of them, then there's already a barrier built into it. How do you know? So it's a very difficult question. For instance, those who are first generation born overseas, Chinese Americans, who do history have no concept of what happened during the exclusion era. And because they're not Cantonese, it was Cantonese completely between 1848 and 1943. It's like 95% Cantonese. The Cantonese culture versus now Taiwan or mainland is so different it's like they're outsiders when they talk to you, but they don't understand the nuances of Cantonese. Is a verbal language, it's not a written language. So it's almost like being in Africa with a spoken language, which is not, you can't write it down. So we have all these kind of barriers in our research.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. For those who have worked with community partners, could you share your best practices or recommendations on how to lay the foundation for shared authority?
Okay, I don't want to dominate this. It's an issue I'm running into right now with the paper sons census. No one wants to talk about paper sons. But like that, it's, but if I said, we're only do demographic data. And even then, as I reached out, I've been a consultant to museums, I've done lots of talks, but still, the key, I have to tell you, it's who you know. I know the directors, someone on the board, who would then, I would send it to them and try to get them involved, and they said yes, and that's how I got into Island Immigration Foundation. I know the senior board member, the chairman of the board, we've known each other for years, and that kind of trickled down. And even then, they're not willing to publish the report. They don't want to put the name on the report. And I said, okay, I'll publish it as a journal article. But they're willing to do a public national event, which is kind of neat, to try to solicit other organizations. But these organizations, because of long-term relationships with them, I'm able to reach out and say, hey, won't you get involved? But it's the name of the organization that carries the strength. I, as an individual, don't have enough strength to carry the project forward. I can do the research, but I need the other organizations to say, I need to be able to list them. Angel Island Foundation, Ethnic Studies Berkeley, Stanford, blah, 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 blah. It's all the weight and value of the name connection that allows me to go forward with the study. Everyone says it's a good study, but they're kind of afraid of it because they're afraid of not revealing something about their relative. And every family in Chinatown up until the 40s, 50s had someone in their family who was illegal. I had a friend who she said, as she left as a child, her grandmother would scream at the children, false papers in Chinese, which means don't talk to anybody. We'll all get deported. And this was into the 50s and 60s. So you can see how strong that is. That's carried forward into the community, even to the those who are still dinosaurs like me. That's it.
I guess I can add to this well. So talking about working with community partners and how you go about laying the foundation for shared authority. So I think I kind of already had community partners baked into my project since they're the ones who approached me about it. But especially as we kept adding different groups, so we worked with the University Development Office, our alumni office, very specific alumni groups, current students, people within the Office of Multicultural Affairs. And so I think something that's important to keep in mind is to make sure to think about the motives of all of your different partners and why they are coming to this project, and make sure to honor those motives as well so that they get what they want out of it. You can get hopefully what you want out of it too. And so everyone's kind of happy. It builds that trust. So for example, Multicultural Affairs wanted these exhibits to be a celebration. They didn't want us to uncover, to hide anything bad, that sort of thing. But it still kind of needs a bit of a celebratory tone, at least the exhibits that related specifically to the Black Cultural Center. So I think the tone of those exhibits would be very different if I had just decided to write it myself, maybe. I don't know. But also another example of motives, my cat is currently scratching on my door because she wants in. This is fun. Hopefully you can't hear that. So other motives, for example, that's good, no one can hear it. Other motives are undergraduate students. So we have a very small history department here. We do not have a graduate history program, graduate sociology program, other programs that really focus on interviewing skills. We are a school that very much markets its engineering program. So most of our students that actually did our interviews were engineering students. So very different background. And I can tell going into it, a lot of these students kind of saw this more as a networking opportunity. They don't have the chance to talk to a lot of Black alumni. So they would pick out people that were either in areas that they wanted to be, or were from where they wanted to be, or were their major. And that's cool too, because then they actually have that natural connection. When you listen to the interviews, you can tell that they saw it as a networking thing as well. And I think for people that are very trained professional or oral historians, I think some of the interviews would probably put them off, because sometimes the students' voices are very much in there, where they're having their added analysis and not just letting the actual alumni talk. But I'm happy with it, because we actually then get the double perspective of a current student and an alumni. So it's the benefit, and they get something out of it. And it also was, student labor is also a tricky subject for me too, because I don't like having students work on something that they're not getting paid for. The ones that were doing this through a very specific class, so I feel better about that at least. So especially taking into account what they're getting out of it is really important, I think, so that you can have a genuine product that is what everyone wants.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about our work with community partners. So like I said, the initiative is very community partner driven. Like I said, we don't do any of the interviews, it's all community partners. And so one thing is that it's a relationship. And so there is no immediately going and saying, hey, do this interview, or can you start interviewing? This is a really long process. Like, we want to start something, give it years for it to start really developing, because we need that trust, we need that relationship. We want to make sure that they're comfortable with working with us, and that they're okay with keeping this history here. And so, listening to issues is to what they think and what they need is so important. One thing that we did, and adapting is so important too. So one thing was that we talked about, usually with oral histories, people give up their intellectual rights for the oral history. After talking with community members, that was not okay with the Black community here, for very obvious reasons. So we took that out of the deed of gift. We just took it out, and they're able to maintain their intellectual property right. And just that alone is so helpful for so many people. We also keep things on SoundCloud for the hip hop interviews, because it's so widely used in the hip hop community. And so we listen and we adapt to what people need. We also attend visits. We donate to local organizations, and we have a booth at the local Hot Corner Festival, which is a Black business district down in downtown. So we just have to make the effort and nurture this relationship. Another thing is that we pay all of our interviewers. So the people doing the interview, the people maintaining the recording equipment and doing all of that, we make sure that they are paid for their work, especially among the Black community and other historically excluded communities, because we don't want to make people do free labor. And if we have the opportunity to pay them, we will definitely pay them. And so if it means a few less interviews, then so be it, because that's one of the most important things for our program.
Thank you. That's so powerful. So for the research, what creative ways did you overcome any research barriers as you worked to elevate these histories?
I can go ahead and chime in here. I kind of mentioned it already, but the Charlestown Navy Yard's collection is very sparse. Even the National Archives doesn't only has bits and pieces of information. So as I mentioned, I tried to go out into other local archives. I was fortunate enough that I was allowed to do that in my position. Boston University had a collection of Julian D. Steele, who is was the president of the Boston chapter of the NAACP. And so I was able to, scan through his collection and found a couple mentions of the Charlestown Navy Yard. I mean, one of the individuals that I was looking into. And so just going to, trying to think of different ways of approaching the subject. Trying to look at different collections that might be tangentially related to the individuals, especially one of the individuals, I know she was a member of a club, and I found out that the Cambridge Public Library had a collection of the club, and I was actually able to find poems written by the woman I was researching in that collection. So then I was able to use her voice within the story map that I created, which I think was, adds a very powerful element to her story. So trying to do whatever I could. I think it's also important that if you don't know something, that it's okay to mention that you don't know the full story. And for one of my story maps, there's a gap in this gentleman's life that I couldn't figure out. And so I mentioned, a couple options, but that we essentially don't know. And we'll likely never know, and that's okay.
What in the, let me just mention, in the Chinese American history issue, the interest in Chinese American history and public history occurred in the 1960s following civil rights and other cultural changes and so on. And the people who funded the historical societies and so on were second and third generation. We're now losing the third generation the second and third generations lived in Chinatown. So they know the history, they knew everybody, and they kind of had it in their heads. We're losing now the third generation, and the Chinatowns are now not the same composition. It's people who come from mainland and Taiwan, and they have no interest in supporting any efforts to capture that history. So this is kind of a critical time, and the way to do that is these third generation people who are now in their 70s and their 80s have a great deal of interest in genealogy. And so I'm working through the historical organizations in New York and San Francisco and saying, if you want to do genealogy, you need to capture oral histories. And I'm conducting oral history workshops for them to show them how to conduct a history where you get information that we can rely on, and you can then share it with the Historical Society, and we can then pool it to get aggregate information too, as well as individuals. So that's been a unique situation in the Chinese history thing, is that we're losing the third generation who were the fund. They provided the funds and the interest, and they're disappearing, and their children in the suburbs, and they have no relationship to their, to the history that their parents know. And then 2/3 of all Asian Americans are foreign born, the first generation, so they have no interest. So we've got a very shrinking population of people we have to deal with as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I think Hayley and I can also speak to research barriers. There is no documentation that currently really exists in Louisiana about this internment camp. So from the very first step, it's been research barriers left and right. So what we have done, and the research barriers are not just that they're not located in Louisiana, but they're located in print in archives like DC at the National Archives, or in LA or in Hawaii, and none of it has been digitized. So our creative workaround was to get as much grant funding as we possibly could through a bunch of different avenues, whether it was like the American Library Association or our Louisiana Board of Regents, to be able to travel to these places and find this information as we could. That's been our big saving grace, I guess, for this project. Wouldn't exist if it wasn't for that family that lived in Alexandria, as well as as the grant funding.
Yeah, without the grant funding, we would have never been able to do the research.
Yeah, so that's our workaround. Okay, last question. If you could do something differently, what would it be?
I would have videotaped my oral history. I did 65 oral histories back in the 70s and 80s, and doing it independently and by myself. And between business trips, I drop in, find someone to interview. And that was not a time it was easy to do video recording. You know, I'd go to somewhere on a business trip. When I find someone and do an interview, I'd bring my tape recorder. It would have been nice to have done video, but that I was just too early. But I have the 65 oral histories. You know what they say, but sometimes seeing is understanding their expressions. And, you know, for instance, when I write listen to the tapes and interview, a laugh can mean several things. It can be embarrassment, it can be happiness, it can be other things, but all I hear is a laugh. But because I know what we were talking about, then I can interpret that and put notes in. But for other people who did not do the interviews, if I didn't notate this thing, they wouldn't know. And that's why videotaping I think is very important. But on the other hand, videotaping was been very intrusive in the 1960s to my interviewees. If they're not going to sign off on a release, they don't want to be photographed. So, you know, I'm kind of working between the lines. I would love to have done some video, but I didn't do any of it.
I think in my case, I would love to see more community partners brought to the table in this research and sharing these stories. And possibly, you know, we might have to expand the scope of the initial project instead of just focusing on the Great Migration at the Charlestown Navy Yard, and maybe tell a larger Great Migration story of Boston and bring in more community partners. So I think that's a hope that I would love to see happen with this project. Yeah.
I guess something that I wish was different is probably something other people would agree with, which is more time and more money, which doesn't always happen. But so our timeline, we were asked to join in on the anniversary celebration at a meeting. I think it was mid to late June. And technically the anniversary was in August, that following bit. And so we did not get an exhibit up by then, as you can probably imagine, because first we needed to actually process the papers of the Multicultural Affairs Office before we even had enough of a sense to start even saying anything about the history, let alone picking out items and creating a cohesive narrative, that sort of thing. So one of our workarounds for that was to split it up into a series of exhibits, where our first one was kind of interpretation light, if that makes sense. It was very much focused on the events of the center. It was an exhibit that went up in September, so as close to around that as the time of the anniversary as we could. So it was a lot of flyers, a lot of talking about the variety of programming. And then our next exhibit that went up in November was more meat on the actual history, and a lot of interpretation, and a lot of contextualizing it and what else was going on in the US and cultural centers in general. And so I think with more time, you can always do more. And so that's nice too. But kind of our oral history project kept getting pushed back a little bit, since it did end up being done through a class, something that naturally happens. Students tend to wait till the very end of the semester to do the oral histories. Sarah and I were in that boat not long ago when we were doing them, so we get it. And so that meant that most of the oral histories were done actually after our first exhibits were out. So that was a little frustrating, where we lost those voices, but we went back and added in things to the exhibit, so it works out. And then, yeah, trying to find ways to, this would have been a great project to apply for grants, absolutely, but with the timeline, there just wouldn't have been enough time to actually apply and hear back and use the money for that. So hopefully maybe we can use it going forward. what else would I have done different? Yeah, money to pay for other people, and especially for pay for our students or other people to review the materials, to maybe write blog posts, do other interpretive projects. It would have been cool if we have a really strong art department, so it would have been really cool if we could have incorporated some of our students of color to maybe look at something and then create a piece based off of that to expand beyond just written narratives. So maybe this will continue in the future, and I'll write some grants so that we can do this. We'll see.
I will second on the time piece. And I think with that, also just understanding how long these things take. You know, even after the partnerships are made and after we've identified our community partners who are going to do the oral histories, and they've identified people, the actual getting the oral histories done, they take so long because, you know, especially pre-COVID, you have to coordinate a time and a place that works with everyone involved. And so, you know, we were getting oral histories a bit slower than we expected. And so just understanding that it's going to take longer than we want, and especially with COVID, that even slowed down the process even more. We are under 2 national grants. Luckily, they both extended our time with that, because there was no way we could have supposed to be over with. So that was very helpful. But yeah, just understanding.
For Hayley and I, we're librarians. We are not historians, and I think we made the classic mistake of going straight to the primary documents and maybe not going into background research and secondary sources to put everything that we were learning into a perspective, so that at a certain point, it got to be a little overwhelming, but have since, you know, really through amazing friends in the field and colleagues in the field who have guided us in this really complex and tragic history, you know, we just dove straight into it, not understanding everything that was happening at that time. So that's what we talk about when we say it's changed our whole perspective to teaching, is that, you know, we did exactly what we're trained not to do as trained researchers. We still did it. So that is the one, our one big mistake, but it was such an incredible learning experience that's changed our like instructional identities. It's changed our research identities. It may have changed our, you know, our just general understanding of the world at this point. Yeah. So I'm very thankful in a weird way that we did do it wrong. But yeah, that's if we could have done it again. But we do have a question from one of our audience participants. This is a question from Abby. Is there any advice? Oh, sorry, I just lost it. Apologies. Is there any advice for doing research on communities that have not been here for as long? So doing an oral history project with recent immigrants. Does anybody have any suggestions about that?
Yeah, may I offer some suggestions? I think the poster child for interviewing immigrants is the Ellis Island Protocol. Absolutely. First, they're done by interviews, and I haven't looked at it for a long time. I believe they use interviewees who understood the language, were familiar with the language, or spoke the language of the interviewee. And then they were reviewed by a second person who then, there are 2 or 3 layers of reviews before the oral history was published. And I think going to looking at what Ellis Island did is really the place to start, because they've done a lot and they're consistent. The technique, the protocols are consistent. I think that's very important. Consistency in oral history is so critical. And this is the, I don't want to put down students, I've worked with students, but there's not consistency. And this is, you don't know what they're going to do. They're going to wait to the end of the semester, I'll get it done, and so on. If you train people, volunteers, I have no problem getting people doing free labor. They're not in the creation community. They want to contribute to their own history, and they're not afraid of that. You know, I'm sure that's different in the Black culture. So I think the protocol from Ellis Island, I really love it. it's a really good place to go start, see how they did it.
I can go ahead and add to that. I would highly recommend the community partner model of, having people within the community do those oral histories just because they have some other basic knowledge of the community. And another thing I would recommend is uh, to make relationships or acquaintances with the community leaders within that specific community. So maybe a church or a nonprofit or something like that, and they could always help you if they're willing to work with you, finding people that could be interviewed or could want to do it. But it is a very tricky thing, especially with recent immigrants. Especially about their documentation. I would highly, look into, if you're looking at undocumented, to be very wary of that. We personally do not, because of the issues around it and the safety of the people, but also just to understand the safety issues with oral histories in general. Especially if you're putting it online, the stuff is going to be online. People are going to be able to see it. There have been people who have asked to have their interviews down because people look. So, these things, the implication things that are online, and to know what that means for their life, potentially. And one kind of workaround that you could do is look at nonprofit workers. So maybe people who work with immigrants, maybe they themselves are not, but they work within the community. And so you could talk about their work and what they do without going into the actual vulnerability of that community.
I think when you're working with recent immigrants, you have to be aware of the differences between the ethnicities within a culture. They're not just Africans, they're not just from Senegal, they're not just from China. There are these different ethnicities, even in the Cantonese. And so you have to be very aware that who you're dealing with, that when you interview them, someone's giving you the background to understand who these people are. And if you have an interviewer who's from the other side of the river, you may get different interpretations of what the person is saying. So it's very, I think it's very useful, but it's a very tricky area to work in. And you have to be very, very careful that you really are getting information as opposed to what they're trying to tell you, the interviewer. Because you understand, recent immigrants are very nervous about who they are and the security, where they're in the society, how do they fit in, especially of color. And this is a real problem. And they've given up everything to immigrate. And so, you have to be very respectful. The Hispanic communities, I've worked in 5 different Hispanic parishes. I'm a deacon. We can't even get them to get a free bank account. You just don't want any information on them. And at Bellevue Hospital, we work on the chaplain, there's a big sign is, we don't care whether you have any documentation, we're here to take care of you. So that's a real big issue, I think, as Sarah was mentioning about dealing with undocumented people. Very, very difficult.
Thank you all so much. I don't see any more questions coming in from the, any questions coming in from the audience. I thought I'd give it maybe one more minute just in case there is one that's just being typed in. But I was wondering if you were interested to give any final thoughts, anything that you're excited about with your project, anything to leave us as we head out on this really, thank y'all so much. This was so illuminating to hear everybody's experiences and takes, and your projects are so amazing. And from Hayley and I, we just want to thank you all so much for being a part of this. We want to thank NCPH, but I will And if you all have anything to say,
I can say one thing. I just found a book I want to read. This is called Interpreting Immigration at Museums and Historic Sites by Dina A. Bailey. I guess it was one of the books I read from the course. Immigration research. It's a place to start in terms of especially when you're doing interviews and stuff. It's just a resource.
All right, well, thank you all so much for participating in the panel today. Thank you everyone who attended the panel. And again, if you have any questions, you can post them in there and we'll hang on for another minute or two and then say our goodbyes.
Thank you, Hayley and Sarah, again for forming this panel and inviting us to join it.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to everyone who came to listen to us.
It's nice to be on the panel and have attendees. Sometimes you think you're working in a cave by yourself. There's no one ever even interested in what you're doing. So this has been a wonderful experience. Thank you very much, Sarah.
All right. I think we'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you again, everybody.
wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, attendees and panelists. And thank you again so much for everything. We can't thank y'all enough.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.